Hey everybody, ipenguinpat here, and today we are going to be doing some attack speed testing. Specifically, we're going to be looking at the interaction of some legendary gems with channeling skills, and also we're going to look at Vithus and Trickshot and kind of see how they all interact with each other. This is going to be especially interesting to wizards and barbarians, although if at some point some of the other classes have some good channeling skills, they may also find this to be interesting. This whole investigation started after a content creator said that Carson's Invigoration was a pretty good 1-star gem for wizards because it helped to speed up the channeling abilities. Immediately, several people noticed that this description says that the primary attack speed is what is increased, and that it's not just flat attack speed. And then some people commented and replied and said, but it speeds up the animation and gets the skill out faster. So we have done some data collection, and we will be using some slow motion to figure out how the animation speeds are affected, if at all, and if this does in fact affect any channeling abilities. Another thing we're going to look at is the popular skill Ray of Frost and the Phantom Ray ability. That's where it leaves a copy of the wizard spraying Ray of Frost in your face. To start with, we're going to look at Arcane Torrent and Disintegrate, and this is actually with a 2% attack speed increase, which I didn't realize I had. And you can see that the startup is a little bit quicker for Arcane Torrent, but the total channel time is identical, 5 seconds. Next, we look at a rank 6 Trickshot Gem. It provides a 17% slower consumption rate. The interesting part is that it extends the duration by 1 full second, which is longer than you would expect, and brings some attention to how attack speed is actually calculated. More about that in a second. This time we're testing the Carson's Invigoration rank 4 overlaid with a regular Disintegrate beam. And you can see that the startup and full duration is exactly identical. There is absolutely no difference with Carson's Invigoration, and there should be with an 8% increase. So, myth busted.
Oh, now the truth comes out.
Next up is the Vithus 4-piece buff, and it cuts off almost 2 full seconds, and that's almost a half second faster than what you would expect. Next up is Vithus paired with Trickshot, and this goes ridiculously fast too, and is a extremely good combination for high damage output. And our final test shows Waking Invocation. I did put together a spreadsheet with some of the results. Now, I did a lot more testing than just this, but these were the cleanest ones and they were consistent, so this is what we have. Also note that I did change my notation here for the seconds and frames to use the regular frame notation. So when you see the 4:52, that is 52 out of 60 frames, just to be clear. There will be a link to this spreadsheet in the comments and description below. So a few things that I did notice were that the channel duration was the exact same for Disintegrate, Arcane Torrent, and Ray of Frost. That was something that I did not expect. I thought that Arcane Torrent had a faster channel duration, so that was interesting takeaway. Also, it did feel like Arcane Torrent had a slightly faster startup, although it could just be that the animation for the startup is just slightly different and I wasn't noticing, or it wasn't showing the time delay or lag between pressing the button for Arcane Torrent and when the initial animation came out. Also, when I started recording, I did not realize that I had a 2% attack speed bonus, so I did include that and I've tried to factor that into the calculations. So as we look through this, we see that there is about a quarter second of startup animation for each of these, and we did see that when you have an attack speed bonus such as Vithus, it does reduce the animation startup speed. We did see that the Carson's Invigoration made absolutely no difference to channeling with respect to the startup frames, with respect to the channel duration, or any of that. And any nonsense about Carson's improving your attack speed or your channeling speed in particular is nonsense. It is not true. It only affects the primary attack. The next thing that stood out is how the calculation for the consumption reduction works. I was thinking at first that it would just be a simple scenario of multiplying by the percentage, so 5 times 1.17, and that would come out to be 5.8 5, which is not what the actual result is. The actual result comes out to being about 6 full seconds with that 17% reduction. Now keep in mind that I have that attack speed, which is why mine came off a little bit short. But here's the point, is that the way that you actually get the full reduction amount calculated is you start with 100%, you reduce the consumption by 17%, so you are dealing with 83% consumption instead of 100% consumption, which gives you 6 seconds instead of just 5 for a rank 6 trick shot. Obviously you would adjust according to the level of reduction. Next up, we'll look and see how the Carsons affected things. And this isn't going to take long because it really didn't change anything. We see that the startup frames and the duration of the channel is exactly the same as if we didn't have the Carsons at all. So we can put that whole myth to rest. Moving right along to Vithu's Urge, we have a lot of more interesting things to look at. We were expecting this to come out around 3.9 seconds, and instead it came out at closer to about 3.25 seconds, or that is 3 seconds and 16 frames. And that's about 40 frames faster, or about 2/3 of a second quicker than what we had originally expected. And this is highly unusual. Additionally, when we added the trick shot in, the rank 6 trick shot, we saw an even larger variation between what we were expecting and the speed difference. In this case, it's 50 frames faster, which is getting very close to a full second faster than what we had anticipated. The bottom line is that Vithu's Urge increased the channel speed significantly faster, so much faster than what we were expecting to see. And that makes me really curious how it affects not only the channeling speed and how to calculate that, but also how it affects primary attack speed and if primary attacks get the same type of benefit that channeling does. It also makes me wonder, do we lose damage from the channeling being reduced so much, or are we condensing the same amount of damage in that much smaller of a space? Just touching on the Ray of Frost with Waking Invocation really quick. The Phantom Ray channel was not affected at all by increasing the attack speed or using Trickshot Gem to increase the duration of the channel. Those had no impact. However, the Freedom and Devotion, which increased the summon duration by 10%, did have an effect and clearly showed that the Waking Invocation Phantom Ray is treated as a summon and not as a normal channel ability. Also of note is that the Vithu's Urge did increase the speed at which the spell was cast from the standpoint of the initial animation started faster. However, the rest of the spell proceeded as usual once the initial startup animation was completed. The other thing that was really weird was how the Phantom Clone, or whatever you want to call it, stopped channeling before it disappeared and started kind of wandering around and walking away. I don't really know what it was doing. There's definitely some amount of duration from an effectiveness standpoint that was lost during that. Based off of this, I suspect that any of the damage increasing magic abilities or magic stats on gear will benefit this and will give this an additional buff beyond the standard damage that it would do. Before I had looked and confirmed that the Carson's Invigoration had no effect on the cast time, I also did some testing to see if adding primary attack damage affected channel abilities, and I could definitely confirm that it had no effect on channel abilities. It was just a little experiment and it just confirmed what we already thought and knew. Finally, let's talk about the formulas for how attack speed and channel duration are affected by these modifiers. Coming into this, I was expecting this to be a much more straightforward and clear calculation, and the more I played with the numbers, the more it became apparent that it's not straightforward and that there are certainly other factors that are stacking in different ways or happening that are different than really how any of us thought, or at least that's the perception that I have and what I've gathered from talking with people. Let's start with the channel reduction, because that's the area that I actually feel most confident about talking about. If we start with a channel duration of 5 seconds and we use a 17% 100% reduction, there is a multiplier that is determined by taking the 100% and subtracting the 17%, and that tells us that the duration change is an additional 1 second, and the full duration will be about 6 seconds. Now, if you rank up your Trickshot Gem to rank 10, you will now have a 24% reduction in consumption, which gives you about 1.6 seconds of extra channel duration, which is pretty significant. That gets you up pretty close to 7 seconds. But the really interesting part is when you awaken some of your main hands, and one of them will do a 10% reduction. Now, based off of that, we had originally assumed that it would be a 34% reduction total, and based off of that amount, we would be looking at about a 2.6 second addition of time, which would take us to about 7.6 seconds of channeling. However, through observation and talking with people, it comes out to be closer to about 7 seconds with the awakened. And that means that it had to be separated. So if you separate off the 10% from the 24, that also takes off about 0.6 seconds, and that brings the total duration to about 7.1, and that is around the range of what players are observing when they are awakening their main hand. The duration calculations were a little bit weird, but they weren't so wildly weird that they didn't make sense. When we start talking about attack speed, that's when stuff gets strange. Now, the first differentiating factor between the attack speed and the channel consumption is that the channel consumption only affects the channel consumption, whereas the attack speed also takes into account the animation when it factors how fast everything goes. With the baseline calculations, we have a 5-second channel time, we have a 0.3 second cast animation, and we have a 2% attack speed increase. That will reduce the time for our cast by 0.1 seconds, and that will make our cast time around 5.2 seconds, which is around 5 seconds and 12 frames. And if you look at our numbers up here, that is within 3 or 4 frames of what we had, and that is pretty dang close. It's pretty hard to tell the difference of 4 or 5 frames when you're looking at 60 frames per second. So the next part is where the weirdness starts. Imagine you have Vithus going off. When that happens, that would reduce the duration by 2.5 seconds, which is a lot. And that would take the full cast time, meaning the animation and the channel, all the way down to 2.8 seconds, or about 2 seconds and 48 frames. And when we look and see, that's not what we observe, right? That's definitely considerably faster than what we observed. So there has to be something else going on. Now, if we unstack these like we did with the channeling, we get a little bit closer. Now we're at 2 seconds and 55 frames, and that's within about 20 frames or so of what we observed. It's still not quite on point, but it's pretty close. Now, what's interesting is that if we cap out at 28, we end up getting almost exactly on point of what our estimation was. We end up being right here at the 3 seconds and 8 frames, and our observed amount was 3 seconds and about 11 to 16 frames, which is very close. Which begs the question, are we dealing with a situation where the attack speed is capped at 30%? And if so, are we layering the attack stat the same way? And if that is the case, does it turn out that we actually end up losing attack speed when we have attack speed baseline if we have Vithus going off?
I'm so confused and surprisingly curious.
Let me put some numbers to it because that might make more sense. Say we go with a 10% attack speed and only 20% of the Vithus goes off. That increases the duration by a significant amount. Here you can see that now that cast speed or that cast time would be about 3.4 seconds, even though we have a faster baseline because of that artificial cap. Now going back to say just a straight 30 second, whereas Vithus only, then we'd be looking at almost exactly 3 seconds on the dot. Again, back to the 2% 128, and that puts us at about a 1/10 of a second longer duration. So this begs the question, does an entire channel bar of damage do the same amount regardless of how fast the attack speed is? Through the magic of editing and spreadsheets, I have a table to kind of try to explain the idea because it's really confusing otherwise, and numbers make this easier to see. So our baseline of 0 attack speed boost gives us about 6,600 damage per second in this hypothetical scenario. Say we bump up to that 2% attack speed boost, that takes our DPS up to 6,700. And then when Vithus goes off, that bumps us up to about 11.1, 11.2 as far as damage per second. Now imagine that we get a buff for a 10% attack speed baseline, like say we re-roll we reforge our bonuses, right? Which is what I was planning on doing. Well, that brings our baseline damage up from the 6,600 to about 7,400, which is a pretty healthy increase. I mean, there's no doubt that would be a nice bonus as far as damage goes. However, when we are in a party and we get Vithus, our Vithus only goes up to about 10.3 instead of 11.1. So we're losing almost 10% damage by having that 10% base attack speed, if this is in fact how the stacking works.
You still don't get it, do you?
Now, obviously the 10.3 is still going to be better than your 7.4. Like, we still are going to want to use Vithus if we have the option, but this definitely brings into consideration whether you are more of a solo player or if you are a player that is constantly able to have Vithus up and running continuously. If you can't continuously have Vithus, then maybe it makes sense to have that extra solo attack speed. Whereas if you are self-buffing and you pretty much always have Vithus up, then you would actually be hurting your damage per second in this scenario. Now, with all of that said, up to this point, this is based off of a relatively small sample size, and we definitely need to do further investigation, but it is already abundantly clear that the way that attack speed works and stacks is not straightforward at all, and the way the calculations work are not as simple and straightforward and transparent and clear as we would hope they would be. And it is also interesting how something that could benefit you more as a solo player could end up hurting you as a party player or as a player that is continuously buffing themselves and so on.
But wait, there's more.
Things get even more wonky when you start factoring in the channel duration. So in this example, say we have the rank 6 Trickshot, which adds a 17% reduction in how fast the channel is consumed. Based off of that, we actually have a slight DPS increase compared to the baseline because there is a greater amount of time where the channel is being done and less percentage of the time is spent during the cast. So overall, the total damage per second is increased. Quite fascinating. And as we increase the speed of the channel, we get more and more benefit. So here you can see that at a 2% increase, we're getting an extra 60 damage per second just by having a longer duration channel. And if we go up to having the Vithus, then we're looking at, again, this is over a 100 damage per second increase just by having a longer duration channel. And then even here, you can see that at a 10% attack speed boost, that's almost 80 DPS more than the baseline duration. All of this hinges on a couple of very specific things, like for example, that the baseline channel doesn't change as far even if the attack speed is increased, and that you are dealing the same amount of damage per bar of channeling. If the amount of damage that you do per bar of channeling varies based on attack speed, then that could completely throw this off. Obviously, there is more research that needs to be done, more data collection in order to clarify these things. So now I'm headed back to the lab with a pen and a pad to get some more data and make this channel better. Yeah, something like that. Anyhow, I hope you found this video to be helpful, and if you did, please like and subscribe if you would like to get more content like this in your feed, and I will catch you in the next video.